I was listening to a thing on the radio the other day. It was more background sound, so I didn't quite catch all the credentials of the person being interviewed. I tried to see if I could look up maybe an audio transcript or whatever of who the writer, what the writer's name was. But he was painting a kind of an interesting picture of traditionally more authoritarian style societies, dictatorships, totalitarian type countries versus countries like our own. And of course, we could have a little bit debate about how free of a society we really are, but I think for purposes of this video, it wouldn't be an unfair thing to say that we enjoy more freedom, or I guess you could say more liberty in a nation like the one I live in, versus, say, living in North Korea or Afghanistan or one of those kinds of places. But he was more talking from a historical perspective, the traditional dictatorship style authoritarian governments of the past, which he had apparently some firsthand experience of. But like I said, I didn't quite catch all of it. And some of what I did hear, like I said, it was background sound. I was driving, for one thing. But one thing he said that kind of stuck out for me, and it got me to thinking about an interesting parallel, was he was saying that in traditionally authoritarian societies, with their military displays of strength and with their the picture they try to paint with their state-controlled media of being this powerful monolith, this powerful entity, that they cannot actually afford to ever admit to errors. They can't afford to admit to mistakes or corruption or any of the number of things that pretty much I think any nation in the so-called free world can admit to. I mean, if you're like me and you like the Netflix series House of Cards, I think pretty much in this country we take it for granted that the people who are running it are pretty corrupt and pretty crooked for the most part. But in a more authoritarian society, or in a traditionally a very totalitarian style nation, you would not be allowed to even have programs like that or even talk about such things in the street corners, because you could disappear or vanish. But that he noticed and like I said, again, I can't catch all the interview because I didn't catch it all. I was driving to a destination early in the morning and it was background sound, but it must have made some sort of impression on me, because it got me to thinking about something that I could talk about for this particular week. Is that if you look at a society such as ours, while if you tuned into the news media, or depending on which media outlet you're listening to, we're either on the brink of completely falling apart, or actually, we've already fallen apart, and we're just in shambles or in tatters. But if you took a very much closer look at the way things are running more efficiently, or the way things are being run in certain aspects of our own personal lives, that life in the 21st century is nowhere near as harsh and nowhere near as I guess you could say, well, harsh, I guess would be the best word to use for it. The mortality rates are lower. People are living longer. The populations are more healthier than you might realize. A few other things, but that a nation that is traditionally more freer, in terms of not being a totalitarian style nation, generally are able to openly air their dirty laundry. They generally tend to air their mistakes. They generally tend to talk about the mistakes they made in the past and what needs to be done to correct those mistakes. They will talk about their injustices. They will talk about things that need to be corrected or need to be improved and need to be, I guess you could say, completely overhauled and redone all over again from the very beginning. But that in a totalitarian style society, it almost seemed like to admit to any weakness, to admit that underneath the proud military displays, and to admit that underneath the state-sponsored media that tells you everything is utopian and all is well, and underneath the little element of fear of the secret police services, depending on what nation you were currently living under, that could show up at your house in the middle of the night and just haul you away, that underneath the veneer of this total, powerful, monolithic strength that all of these totalitarian nations were pretty much crumbling with corruption, eat up with all kinds of corruption, and ultimately eat up with all kinds of weakness, that in effect they were rotten underneath their very core. They were not what they were portraying to the people. I know I can back up some of what he's saying in opinions about books I read about people who lived in the former Soviet Union and what life was like. And I remember even somebody on Quora saying, if you could imagine the music scene in the 1980s, late 70s, early 80s, before Gorbachev started making concessions, he said, if you could picture like the disco scene of the 1970s, if you could picture that, only every single song is about how wonderful the government is and how the crops are better, and the war in Afghanistan that the Soviet Union was currently engaged in at the time was emerging victoriously, then he said you kind of got a picture of the music scene of the late 1970s Russia, early 1980s, depending on when that war started. But that underneath it all, the black markets were running everything, which could not be done away with, no matter how many secret police forces they put out. That thought crime, I guess you could call it, I'm ripping off 1984 by using the word thought crime. I don't know if they had a word like that in the Soviet Union, but it was pretty much present. Subversive style literature, literature that kind of questioned the government, circulated, no matter how many people they locked up, no matter how many people they executed. But that ultimately underneath the entire iron curtain, or the entire facade of having an iron curtain, it was all corrupt to the core. The party leaders were corrupt. They weren't obeying the so-called party principles, and I could go on and on with the list. This is not a dissertation about the Soviet Union or maybe what the Third Reich was like with its eat-up corruption, but it was putting forth this picture-perfect ideal that the citizenry were supposed to buy and were forbidden to question in regards to, this is the perfect world that you are living in, and you had better realize this is the perfect world you're living in, or you will disappear. Whereas in a more freer society like our own, where we may be free to openly complain, we may be free to openly talk about how airheaded our politicians really are, and how corrupt they are, and how bought out they are, and how corporations pretty much buy a whole lot of elections, and I can go on and on with that list, that we are free to do so out in the open. We're free to say that in public. Nobody's going to show up at my house and make me disappear for talking like this if I started talking about government institutions in general, or the fact that most of the citizenry here in the United States widely understands and accepts that most of its governing, ruling leadership is corrupt to the core. And that's not necessarily a party issue either. That's a government issue. And it got me actually to thinking, and I'm tying this into AA, I promise, the interesting parallel between something like AA, which will not admit that it is rotten to the core. And what brought this idea up for a video was there was another article, I know. Most of my videos is I was reading an article, I was listening to an article, I was reading this book, but there was another article that was talking about how harm reduction was starting to take off in the public spectrum, especially in certain states where they were more or less saying, look, we've been throwing rehabs at people and drug court at people, and we've been doing all these kinds of things for as long as the war on drugs has been going on, and it has not gotten any better. Overdose deaths are up. The fentanyl overdoses are up. Right after the pandemic lockdowns and everything, the rates of addiction have skyrocketed, and we just keep sending people to 12-step rehabs, and we keep sending people to drug courts and things like that, and yet nothing is happening that's indicating that the addiction problems in this nation are getting any better. So why don't we try a different approach to it? Now, of course, I don't expect this kind of approach of harm reduction to take off on a very large scale nationwide anytime soon, because there's just far too much money to be made in the 12-step treatment center rehab industry and AA itself, which is indirectly tied into all of it. AA tries to claim they don't have any money whatsoever, even though If you go to digging around deep in the salaries of people at the very top, they're in the 6 and 7 figure digits. And they try to make out like they're just a bunch of humble little people in a church basement somewhere, barely putting in a dollar in the basket here and there to get coffee, and more phony fucking literature and stuff like that. But they're actually a multi-million-dollar monolith in the nation. And underneath the veneer, I noticed in AA of, this is the picture that I first got as a newcomer when I first went to my very first AA meeting was everybody here seems to have their shit together, and I'm the only guy that doesn't. Everybody else here, the steps seem to be doing wonders for. I must be the crazy one because the steps aren't doing anything for me. I'm still just as screwed up as I was when I got here, even though I've done all these steps, even though I've read this book through and through, even though I've gone to meetings every day, even though I've done everything these asshole sponsors tell me to do. And yet I'm not feeling any relief from this whatsoever, and there must be something wrong with me. I must be one of these people that are constitutionally incapable of being honest with myself. I'm one of these people that I'm going to be one of the unfortunates that just seem to have been born that way, as they read at the beginning of every meeting. And it wasn't until I had been around Quackaholics Anonymous for quite some time that I began to notice that a very, very substantial, large portion of the AA population were pretty much like these authoritarian regimes that I opened up this video with. They were utterly rotten to the core. Most of the so-called old-timers that were, looked at as esteemed elders who were at the top of the little hierarchy, even though they'll tell you there's no hierarchy in AA, well, you find out right quick in any meeting you go to for any extended period of time that there most certainly fucking is a hierarchy, and it controls and calls the shots, and you'd better kiss up to that hierarchy if you ever want to be anybody in those meetings. Luckily, I never had to worry about being a part of the hierarchy because I was a relapser, so it was almost like, sit over there, one of the constitutionally incapable ones. We'll all huddle here in our circle and we'll talk about him, But underneath the core of what the image it projected, the image that you get when you first walk in, of all these people having something all together, of having this common solution that's working for everybody, is actually literally like a paper tiger. It's not real at all. As a matter of fact, it's kind of like these authoritarian regimes. It's completely eat up with corruption and rotten, and on the brink of falling apart at any given moment. I got to know a lot of old-timers personally because I lived with one, or I rented from one in his garage during a really, really horrible period in my life when I was borderline homeless. And I did not realize just how rotten at the very core of its membership it was until I got to know a lot of these people. And of course, at this point, this is where usually the people who defend AA will come to this channel and they'll say something like, well, did you ever think about trying different meetings? Well, of course, I thought about trying different meetings. I was only in the thing for over a decade and had moved to several states in the meantime and have been in multiple meetings and had multiple home groups. And guess what? At the core of every single one of them, when I got to know them, really know them, it was the same exact kind of setup. It's almost strange how that kind of worked. When I first got vocal about being against AA, I was vocal against AA online before I started this channel, before I just had enough, and I just had to get something out of my head and put it up somewhere or risk having spontaneous combustion with rage. I was actually shocked at how many people all over. Like, this wasn't just a few people in a locale. This wasn't a few people in one region of the country. This wasn't a few people here and there. This was dozens upon dozens upon dozens upon dozens of people, the entire country in Europe over, that were all talking about the same kind of problem. And what was really disconcerting and frightening to me was how many of the same types of things that I personally witnessed, that I've talked about on here, that the mind games, the gaslighting, the abuse, all that stuff was prevalent in every single one of their tales. It wasn't like it was isolated incidents. It wasn't like it was a once in a blue moon type of thing. It was everywhere underneath the surface of this so-called spiritual program that's saving millions of lives, like they try to lie and say it does. And it never occurred to me during my time in there when I was convinced that I was the one who was crazy, when I was convinced that I was the one who was constitutionally incapable of being honest with myself, that 95% of the people who are exposed to the 12-step cult don't hang around. They don't stay. The turnover rates are very, very high. AA was probably one of the most transitional societies. And of course, I've not been a member of many societies, obviously, but as far as an organization, it was one of the most transitional type organizations I ever saw. You would see a whole group of people come in for a little while. They'd get popular with a little hierarchy running the group, and they'd be called on in every meeting and everything. And then usually one or two of them would show up to get a white chip after having been back out there, as they call it. And the next thing you know, they would all be gone. And then you would have another group of people that are relatively green coming in, and they would do the same kind of thing, rinse, repeat. And then the backbeat of all of this, you would have just a steady stream of people being court ordered in and out, people forced to go there by their rehabs, mandates, and other types of things like that. But there was no longevity that I saw, with the exception of a few bullying old timers and a few people like myself that just didn't have nothing. They didn't have nowhere else to go. I mean, I look back on it now, and I remember a lot of people that were in the same predicament that I was in. We were going to meetings all the time, getting white chips, sitting there, like there was some magical solution to be found in this thing, and there was none. And it occurred to me, back to the earlier thing I was mentioning about the authoritarian style governments that are completely rotten to the core, is they eventually do crumble. They don't tend to hold any longevity in the span of time when you compare them to more freer societies. And I don't know if AA would have imploded on its own. How was I going to word that? Actually, I was wording that all wrong. I got to think about that. AA was already imploding on its own, is what I meant to say, before the government got involved in it. I don't know if it would have even survived past the 1960s had the government not got involved in it. Is what I was trying to get at there. I stumbled over my words for a second because I was looking at a subscriber comment at the same time I was doing this. Without government intervention involved in keeping it alive, and the money that the cash cows that are flowing in through rehab and the halfway house owners. I've talked over and over again about crooked halfway house owners, and I mean, anybody that could open a halfway house. If I wasn't renting this place, I got enough, I got a couch maybe I could bring into the living room and an extra bedroom, and I could say, hey, I'm opening up a halfway house, and I could cram a bunch of people in here, force them to live in really degrading conditions, and not be subject to any government inspections, and not be subject to any of the things that most ordinary businesses and hotels and places like that are subject to. It's literally a cash cow for all kinds of crooked, unsavory people who know there's money to be made off the recovery monolith that are keeping this thing alive as it is today, and the government intervention involved in it. I think it would have long died out were it not for that. And I think the more pushback we begin to see as far as people releasing videos like these, or articles you see like the articles I'm seeing now that are saying, let's explore the possibilities of harm reduction because what we're doing is not working. The interesting thing, although I almost forgot to include this, and again, this is going to be the parallel between the authoritarian societies and AA, is there were a lot of pro-AA people in this news article talking about harm reduction that were gleefully saying, well, harm reduction has failed some people. Harm reduction is, some people have died doing harm reduction. Harm reduction doesn't save everyone. And it was almost like, to quote Marlon Brando from Apocalypse Now, it was almost like the diamond bullet straight through my forehead kind of moment, the eureka moment, because AA fails people all the time. AA fails people 95% of the time, judging by its high turnover rating. They take pride in people dying in there. When people drink themselves to death, what do they say? Some have to die so that others can live. When people fall by the wayside and are forgotten or drink themselves into a state of homelessness, AA people gleefully say, it's by the grace of God that it ain't happening to me. AA never admits the fact that it has a massive failure rate problem. It's like those totalitarian societies I just got through outlining at the beginning of this video. But an organization like Harm Reduction, which will openly admit that it has flaws, which will openly admit it doesn't work for everybody, which openly admits that it has made mistakes and has had failures and has had problems along the way trying to formulate a rock-solid plan on how to deal with addiction, it's almost like an allegorical parable between authoritarianism versus a free society and AA versus the harm reduction method. Harm reduction freely admits mistakes. AA will tell you it makes none because it blames the newcomer, or it blames the relapser, or it blames the person with the addiction for being the failure. AA will say there's no failure here. The same way in the movie Dr. Zhivago, there's the scene where the lead character says, "Is it typhus?" And they say, "You must have been listening to propaganda from the other side. There's no typhus in the Soviet Union." And later on, during a scene, he says, "Yeah, there's another disease going on in this apartment complex that we don't have in Soviet Russia. Starvation." It's kind of funny how that works. Anyway, I think there's a subscriber, I'm going to close with their comment here, that sums up AA perfectly. As a matter of fact, they sum it up better than most of my videos do. And it says, AA basically believes in the misanthropic Calvinist idea that people, here meaning you, the alcoholic, are inherently sinful, selfish creatures who need to have their instincts controlled, pretty much. That they need to be humbled and have their ego right-sized through the steps, and that salvation comes from a spiritual awakening as a direct result of working the steps. And that if you don't have the supposed spiritual experience, then it's obviously due to you not being honest or willing to work the steps hard enough or well enough. At so many meetings, I heard the slogan, the first 3 steps are, "I can't, he can," God, even though it's not a religion. I might as well let him. As well as the narrative during people's shares that went something like, "I learned that when something went right in my life that I had to give God the credit in AA. And when something doesn't go my way, that I take responsibility, look at my part in it, and either make amends for my role or simply accept the situation as being exactly what it's supposed to be according to God's plan." Funny how that fucking thing works, isn't it? You're not allowed to manage your own life. You're not allowed to make any changes on your own life. Now, it's just when things are good, it's AA and God who gets the credit, and when things are bad, it's all your fault. AA's form of spirituality, they write, is basically a constant war on your own self, a constant subjugation of who you are as a person in the name of them as some hazy higher power who, incidentally, you are supposed to make up. It sums up pretty much the whole insanity of the organization. And I think because AA runs like an authoritarian government, that's another reason why it's crumbling within. It can't admit that it made mistakes because it's a religious cult. It can't admit that it's had failures because it's a religious cult. It can't admit how rotten its members behave and that the 12 steps don't do anything for changing you as a person because it's a religious cult. Anytime an organization cannot admit its own mistakes or be willing to change anything to adapt to the changing times, then it's pretty much in danger of going extinct, in my personal opinion. It was almost funny how certain churches have kind of softened their stance on certain things, yet under their claim that God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and can't change his mind, they're more or less admitting that it has nothing to do with God. It has to do with the people itself deciding what the church dictates and practices and preaches, because after all, if they were exclusionary towards certain individuals and now they're not, and they're more inclusionary, then it would mean that it was the people who were making up those rules all along, and it wasn't coming from the God that they claimed to speak for on their behalf. I was going to get into something to do with Vatican II there, is why I was pausing all over the place as a former Catholic, but that would be a whole another long tangent, and I've been talking for 24 minutes and 29 seconds now. So I'm going to say until next time. 4 pounds lighter this week, not very much, but 4 pounds is better than none, huh? Until next time.